Good morning. This is Dr. McDaniel at GYN Corner, back at the horse farm, Baymore Farms in Morganville. I don't see Jill, or is she? It's hard to... Oh, there's my daughter Jill. She just turned 13 this year. She's been riding since she was 5. And we have horse lessons every Saturday at 8 a.m. here in New Jersey. So, she's been riding for 8 years now. We're outside. It's nice to be outside. A lot of times they're inside the corral. Well, this, I guess, is the outside corral. They're inside the barn, really. Because in the winter, the barn is warmer. And in the summer, it's cooler because of the shade. It's a big barn. That's our car. We're the only ones out here today. Someone just showed up. Or not. Looks like they're taking a circle through. So that's the barn where they ride most of the time. It's very big. And she's outside today with her teacher. My other daughter, Joy, is walking around with our Yorkie. I never go inside over here. I can go inside over here. It's a large inside area where the horses are kept also. And all the way down here is a bunch of horses in all the stables. And over here, I can't walk too much over here because I get allergies. I have allergies, so I tend to start sneezing and tearing up. There's one of the horses. Hello. Hello. Ladybug. They ride ladybugs sometimes. Another. And this is Apollo. They like Apollo. Apollo's pretty big. It doesn't look like it inside the stable, but he's a pretty big horse. And then these are all inside stables. Woo. And more of these exterior ones. And end of the tour is going to be all of these exterior ones down here. Whole host of them. I'll go down here and come out the other side. So let's see, as the title indicated, yesterday I spoke on polyps. What are polyps? And today I thought I would just add an addendum to what are polyps. So polyps are abnormal balls of blood vessels. And you can get polyps anywhere in the body. A lot of people are familiar with nasal polyps. Lots of nose bleeding issues with the nasal polyps. Laryngeal polyps are the vocal cord polyps. You always hear about the singers having to have surgery for their laryngeal polyps, or at least seem like you used to. And then there are intestinal polyps. So polyps of the large intestine are the most common. Colon polyps. A lot of people get the colonoscopy. And they have colonic polyps removed. So polyps are most commonly, they're benign. They're just balls of abnormal blood vessels that have been created. We don't really know why some people get polyps and others don't. It's an abnormal response to a normal environment. But skin polyps, which we call skin tags, colloquially they're called skin tags. Skin polyps are thought to be due to friction, increased friction in the region of the skin. I've seen more skin polyps or fibroepithelial polyps in women who wear thong underwear quite frequently. I'll see 1 or 2 small skin tags in that area for women who frequently wear thongs. So it's thought to at least partially be due to increased friction in a region. Oops. So, a little bit more interesting. This guy's jumping over here. This is the guy who's usually here in the morning with us. Actually, he used to come later than us. Now he's been coming earlier than us, so he's been coming like 7:30, 7 o'clock, 7:30. I think around 7:30 every morning. Great. I was going to sit on these benches, and they're totally soaking wet from dew. I'll sit on the other benches, but of course the other benches are out in the sun, so they're hot. This is a nice shady area. Yeah, they're all soaking. Yeah, so polyps, to leave the owner. Polyps are often due to increased areas of friction on the skin. We don't know why some people get polyps, though, in internal areas like that, because there obviously isn't any friction in the internal areas. So we don't fully understand why people get polyps, but we know that they're an abnormal response to a normal environment is kind of the upshot. Yesterday I spoke about mostly cervical polyps, and cervical polyps are quite common. They look, the cervix looks like a mouth, so the polyps often kind of look like this, just kind of sticking out of the mouth of the cervix. And usually they're quite small, like the size of a sesame seed up to a BB shot. Occasionally they will be quite large, like the one yesterday was the size, the length, or the diameter of a quarter, and probably had been growing there for probably a good 2 to 3 years or so. Most commonly, polyps are removed, especially cervical polyps. I'll say all polyps in the colon are removed, because the concern is that it's a potential nidus for cervical cancer. Polyps elsewhere in the body are only removed if they're symptomatic. So usually, since they're balls of abnormal blood vessels, usually the symptom is going to be abnormal bleeding. So quite commonly with the cervix, that person will have bleeding, abnormal bleeding with the menstrual cycle. They'll have spotting or weird bleeding before their cycle, weird bleeding after the cycle, and or just heavier, longer cycles is most commonly what's encountered. From time to time, such as the lady yesterday, she remarked that for the last few years she's been noting bleeding after intercourse. So it will often be a scenario where they don't necessarily have irregular, abnormal, or additional bleeding with their menstrual cycle, but with any kind of increased abdominal pressure or activity, they'll have bleeding. So with intercourse, they have bleeding. When they do any kind of exercises, running upstairs, jumping, standing from sitting, especially coughing or sneezing, they'll notice bleeding. So most commonly, if a polyp is going to have symptoms, it's going to be due to the fragility of those blood vessels, so it's a bleeding symptom. Or if the polyp is getting larger and larger, sitting out in the vagina, it will often have inflammatory changes with it. So she will notice increased vaginal discharge, often bloody vaginal discharge, and that's going to be another reason to remove it, because the polyp is a nidus for infection, for bacterial buildup, growth. And the symptom there is going to be increased bacteria of the vagina, or bacteria vaginitis, because it's inflamed and symptomatic with discharge and irritation and odor, the whole 9 yards. And it's usually going to be blood tinged, because the polyp is inflamed and it bleeds easily. It just bleeds wantonly out the blue. I did not speak about uterine polyps, which we call endometrial polyps, because the lining of the uterus is the endometrium. So when someone has Endometrial polyps, I'd show something besides myself. Endometrial polyps will sometimes be symptomatic, sometimes not be symptomatic, same as elsewhere in the body. If it's symptomatic, it's the same story. Bleeding with the cycle and or bleeding just outside the cycle with any kind of increased abdominal pressure. Endometrial polyps, the evaluation for that is going to simply be an evaluation for abnormal bleeding. And that's going to be in checking for infection, hormones, and then ultrasound or a sonogram. If a sonogram is done and there are polyps seen, then if the polyps are fairly large, which means about a centimeter, 10 millimeters or so, which is like the size of a green pea or so, they will be removed oftentimes, most commonly in day surgery. Occasionally someone will have a setup where they have the anesthetic capabilities and monitoring things to do the removal in their office. Most people are going to have to go to day surgery for all of that setup. If the sonogram shows a fairly large polyp, so size of a green pea or larger, that procedure is called a D&C hysteroscopy with polypectomy. So D&C is just a dilatation curettage, opening the cervix, getting into the uterus and cleaning out. And then hysteroscopy is a camera put into the uterus to look around, identify if there truly are polyps, where they're located, the number, and that they've been removed appropriately. And then polypectomy is just the name of polyp removal. Naturally, all of that tissue is sent to pathology so that it can be evaluated to confirm that this person really did have benign polypoid changes and nothing sinister, so irregular cells, abnormal cells, precancerous changes. If the sonogram does not show polyps, but just that there's potentially a thickening of the uterine lining, then most physicians, most gynecologists will obtain an additional or secondary sonogram called, has two names, saline infusion sonogram, and it's also called a sonohistogram, where a little bit of fluid, normal saline or sterile water, is placed in the uterus, squirted into the uterus to open the uterus. Once the uterus is open, the sonogram is done to see if there are polypoid or irregular abnormal tissue buildup in the lining of the uterus. So once you open the uterus, you take away the pressure, the sandwich effect of the lining of the uterus, so potentially smaller fibroids or even larger kind of spongy fibroids that weren't easily identifiable on the regular sonogram. They're identified on the saline infusion or the sonohistogram because you have the contrast of the normal saline or the sterile water that's basically going to outline the polyps or the mass. Once that's done, it's the same story. If the polyps are seen to be about larger than a green pea, it's usually going to be day surgery. If they're smaller, one could potentially do them in the office. If you do the sonogram and the lining inside the uterus does not look thickened, it looks thin, but you still need to confirm that there aren't precancerous changes or early cancer that's causing the abnormal bleeding, then an endometrial biopsy or an office D&C is done. And sometimes that will confirm on pathology that this lady had very, very tiny polyps, so microscopic polyps. Often they'll state something like fragments of polypoid tissue seen or tufts of polypoid tissue seen. So it's characterized on the pathology evaluation, but they were too small to actually be seen with the naked eye. So polyps can form anywhere in the body. We do encounter them quite often in the reproductive tract. The cervix and the uterus are the most common. Vulvar or the skin, we see polyps, but those are skin polyps or fibroepithelial polyps, skin tags. Every blue moon we'll see them in the vagina. It's very rare to see a polyp in the vagina. Very rare. I've seen them a handful of times for whatever reason. The mucosal tissue or the lining inside the vagina doesn't seem to develop polyps very often. It's very rare. Oftentimes, if there's a mass, it's going to be a fluid-filled or cystic mass, not an abnormal ball of blood vessels, but from time to time I'll see them. So I hope that's been helpful. This is Dr. McDaniel at GYN Corner. Please check out the YouTube channel. It's also called GYN Corner. Like, subscribe, comment. Please ask any questions, post questions or ideas for topics. I'm happy to address any topics or concerns or questions that anyone has. And then, as usual, we're here in the tri-state area. So if you're in the tri-state area, we're in Manhattan, New York City, Midtown Manhattan, right around the corner from Macy's and from Penn Station. A couple of blocks westward of the Empire State Building. So if you're in New York City or in the tri-state area, come on out and visit us. Our website is midtowngyn.com. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you for joining. I'll do a little perusal as we leave the horse farm here. Last perusal. I should have brought a towel or something so that I could clean off those benches and go sit in the shade. I might still do that. Jill's lesson is finished. It's been a half hour already. Joy is just getting herself together. She's over in the corner there. I might add a little clip of Joy on her lessons if I'm feeling energetic today, if I have the extra spurt of energy to do so. I'll add a little clip of Joy later because she's going to have to do a little warm-up first. Warm-ups are kind of boring. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thankfully, we have really nice weather here in New Jersey today. Feels like it's in the 70s. Nice and clear. It's going to be a good day. I have handful of errands to run. And tomorrow I'm